Welcome to The Self-Made Theory, the podcast that's all about innovating, overcoming, and prospering. We interview founders, entrepreneurs, innovators, CEOs, and other exciting people about their amazing business journey. Over to your host, Ben Campbell, for this week's episode.
Welcome back to The Self-Made Theory. You've probably read in some articles lately about how AI, or artificial intelligence, is going to replace many jobs. Well, I've been doing some reading up on the future of jobs, so I invited Dr Eva Balan-Vnuk, a senior business and thought leader, onto the podcast to discuss this pretty important topic. Dr Eva holds the role of Executive Director of ICT and Digital Government for South Australia and has held other senior roles such as the State Director for Microsoft. We cover a lot of interesting topics, and it relates to both business leaders and employees. We talk about, as a leader through times of change, you need to provide hope, trust, empathy and stability for your people. We talk about who's responsible for educating people in times of such radical change. Is it government's responsibility? Is it the employer's responsibility? Or is it employees' responsibility? We talk about, regardless of whether you're a corporation or social enterprise, you have to compete with everybody else to get a dollar out of somebody's pocket. We discuss why diversity is important in technology organisations, and we look at what's the right training model in a world of such great change. Is it uni? Is it vocational? Is it on the job? Or is it just in time? We also cover a lot of other things. We talk about the impact of NDIS. We talk about the freedom of speech. There's a lot going on in this episode. My name is Ben Campbell, and this is The Self-Made Theory. Dr Eva, welcome to The Self-Made Theory.
Thank you, Ben.
I'm really glad that we've got you on the podcast. We've known each other for a few years now. Probably, I think we met when you were the State Director of Microsoft, but you don't hold that role anymore. You hold quite a senior role here inside of the South Australian Government. Perhaps you could just explain that for us.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So my role in SA Government, I'm the Executive Director for ICT and Digital Government in the Department of the Premier and Cabinet. And in a nutshell, that means my team is responsible for whole of government technology, digital and cyber security services for the whole of government, as well as the assurance and governance that goes around that.
So just a small role.
Yeah,
then,
just a small role.
Particularly given in context of what's happening inside of industry and the whole digitisation conversation that's happening in almost every industry as well as government. I imagine it's a pretty big task.
It's actually a fascinating role, and I'm really excited. I mean, you're right, we did meet when I was at Microsoft, and I've kind of accidentally been in the technology sector for my career, which has been great fun. And what I love about the tech sector is actually what it enables. So many people are in love with the technology and the widget itself, which is great, and we need people who are passionate about those specific solutions. I love it because of what it can achieve. And so I really think that my team, we can become such an enabler for government to help modernise the public service, to transform the way that citizens and businesses deal with us and the way that we operate internally, because, you know, government has been a bit of a laggard in terms of adopting new technologies. Part of the challenge is working out, well, how do we actually use them within the government context? But so many opportunities to make a positive impact.
So how you can use them both internally as well as engagement with citizens?
Absolutely.
It's a pretty big organisation, government, and if we were thinking about it in terms of it being a corporation, how many people inside of government effectively are you delivering to?
It's around 100,000 people.
It's huge.
It's actually, you know, just a bit smaller than Microsoft. So, you know, I've been in one big machine most of my life and I'm in another really big machine. But government certainly is quite complex because there is no one overarching chief executive, one overarching chief financial officer. There's each agency reports to its individual minister. The ministers are part of cabinet. So in terms of kind of the reporting structure, it's very different, and each agency is, you know, really dedicated to its own core function. And so our way of, I guess, delivering those core services is we have to be consultative. We have to engage. We have to understand. I think the era of mandates, it's not appropriate. And so we're in the wonderful, tricky position of having to modernise services, but also offer more choice to agencies because they do have more choice these days. And how do we do it in a way, though, that doesn't break, I guess, the integrity of government systems?
And that's the challenge, because if this was a corporation, the CEO could say, this is what we're doing and suck it up, people. That's the way it's going to happen, whereas that can't happen inside of government. And is that part of the reason perhaps why I think you referenced before about government being slow in terms of the adoption? Is that part of the reason, do you think?
I think government certainly, the intent is to do good things. And what you have is you have different people and different ministers, and they've got their own priorities and their own outcomes they have to drive. And so, we are in an environment of constraint. So, my boss frequently tells me we're never going to have all the money we want to do, all the great things we want to do. That's the reality of it. So it's understanding, how do we, in an environment that is sometimes fragmented, how do I focus on understanding the needs of each of those individual agencies and how to support them as best we can, knowing that there are differences. The big agencies, they have more capabilities than very small agencies, but at a fundamental layer, there are some commonalities about what they could use.
So why you? I mean, I know that the government did a nationwide search looking for the right person to fill this role. Why did they choose you, do you think?
That's a great question, Ben. I'm delighted they chose me because I'm loving the challenge.
I know a lot of your team are delighted too, so that's a good thing.
So what was very interesting is that it was a very rigorous selection process and for very good reason. And because when you have a senior role that potentially has this influence across government and ability to impact change, you need to hire the right person. And, when I went through the process, I was actually, before I knew that I had the job, I was actually really happy because I felt I had the opportunity through that process to present me. Who am I essentially? What kind of a leader am I? How do I think about people? What are my capabilities? And so I felt that if they didn't choose me, then I wasn't the right person for the job, and that was fine. But I'm hoping that the complement of the skills I have, my values, I had to do a psychometric assessment, that I think played a role in the selection process. And I'm really enjoying it. I think I've made the transition from private to public sector quite well. Yes, there are bits that perplex me, but that's fine too. And I think sometimes it's really great to kind of ask why, with the intent of really understanding, not to dismiss, but to understand, well, why does it work this way? And if that's the case, is there a way to do it better that we haven't maybe attempted or thought of before?
Keen to perhaps understand a little bit about your background, given that effectively you're in STEM and you're a woman in leadership, and they are really important topics in the world today. Perhaps can you sort of unpack a little bit about your history so that people understand how you got to be in such a great position today?
Oh, look, I think everyone's individual career path is a fascinating story. I'm not sure there are many people who have such a clear idea at the age of 5 they want to be X and their path magically goes that way. I really remember as a child just wanting to be happy. I didn't have a particular career aspiration. And when I was in high school, my dad actually asked a close friend in the professional world to effectively do a kind of a questionnaire to help me work out which sector might I be best suited to. And actually came out with hospitality and tourism, which I think was quite interesting. I did a marketing degree at the University of South Australia, and I joined a student organisation at uni, ISEC, and that was fabulous because it opened up the world to me. So my first, real job was as an intern in Vienna in Microsoft. And that's how I started my professional career. And that was accidental that it was Vienna in Austria and accidental that it was Microsoft. But as I said, I've stayed in the sector, and I stayed with Microsoft for almost 15 years in a number of countries and different roles because I love what technology can do. And I'm also used to, even in a big organisation, being in a really small team that has to do a lot of things on the smell of an oily rag. Not all parts of companies are resourced the same. The part of Microsoft that I was part of made a loss for many, many, many years. And so the years that we kind of finally turned a profit in Microsoft was a cause for great celebration, but we'd been used to operating with very few resources and having to be very creative and use bricolage really to think about how do we combine resources in new and different ways to get the outcomes we wanted. I've in many cases been supported by both my female and male managers, senior managers, which has been fabulous. Microsoft, working in the tech sector, it's a pretty gender diverse business, but I would say being in the tech sector, we don't have enough diversity. And it's not just gender diversity, it's diversity of ideas, of perspectives, of backgrounds. because I'm of the firm belief, if we've got the tech sector, which has got such an influence over every aspect of our lifespan, and yet only a small group is crafting and dictating what that technology looks like, and yet they're not representative of our population, I think we've got a problem.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, absolutely. You've done some post-grad studies too. You did a PhD. What drove you to do that?
So I certainly didn't anticipate that I would do that. It was lots of fun. I'd been with Microsoft around 9 years. So I'd had 5 years in Vienna and then 4 years in Singapore. And actually my husband was looking at doing some further study in Australia. And so he got a PhD scholarship. And there'd been a lot of change at Microsoft. And I was really thinking, what is my impact? What is the contribution I'm making? So I decided that I would give it a crack too. I had to do honours first. So I came back and we both moved back to Australia. I did honours at the University of South Australia, which was fabulous. And then I did my PhD at the University of Adelaide. And that was quite a shock. If you want to do honours or a PhD, you have to write a letter of application to the university. You have to explain what your topic is, why it's important, and you have to cite academic papers. I tell you, I got a bunch of academic papers and I couldn't even get through the first paragraph because it was so dense with about 15 different concepts and footnotes and asterisks. And I'm like, oh my God, I can't even work my way through this intellectually. And it just proves that when you give something a good go, you get used to style, you get used to thinking about ideas in a more challenging manner, in a more critical manner. And I really loved it. I loved that my brain was being stretched again, I guess, in directions that hadn't had the opportunity to do so.
So what was your study on?
So I looked at entrepreneurship and innovation. And so my honours thesis and my PhD was an extension of my honours thesis, was looking at the strategic concepts or ideas that drive the business model strategy of non-profit social enterprises. So in a nutshell, how do these non-profit social enterprises, how do they stay financially viable? Australia does not have a great philanthropic culture. The US has a great philanthropic culture. And, we look at some of the greats like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Warren Buffett. They're giving away billions of dollars. And it's not just at that super high level. It's wealthy, but more regular Americans have a culture of philanthropy. So I was really concerned when I was speaking then to these, the chief executives of these social enterprises. I realised it's such a fragile ecosystem. Each social enterprise is absolutely dedicated to meeting the needs of a really particular group in society that are vulnerable, disadvantaged. And if they shut down, if they can't survive financially, that group is just unsupported. Yeah. And that's a loss to society. So I wanted to understand, how did they really craft their way of generating revenue? It was a kind of no-brainer in the end, because if you think about an organisation like Nutrition Australia, so they've obviously got a body of knowledge around nutrition and health, and so they started to generate funds by advising new shopping centres and their food halls and giving, how many stars of healthiness were the foods here, and consulting using that body of expertise. And then others like, Bedford and Minder, how we've got people who want to contribute to society and do so in a respected manner that, is dignified. Well, they've got supported work opportunities. So each of these kind of social enterprises found their niche, but in a way that was really complementary to their mission. And it has to be complementary because otherwise there'd be a dissonance, and the public would say, hang on a second, why would, for example, the Salvation Army, imagine if they sold home brew kits. Oh my gosh, there would be uproar. It's an anathema to their value set. So many social enterprises have kind of figured this out intuitively, and more are being creative and finding new ways to generate funds for their organisation.
It's a bit of a challenge, isn't it? Because really there's competition with industry. There's competition with fundamentally almost every part of society, because there's only $1 that's got to be shared around, and so in somebody's pocket. So whether they spend that on social enterprise, whether they spend it on some other purchase or acquisition, or whittle it away on something else, they've got to compete. And so I imagine the challenge is making sure that they maintain their integrity around how they compete for that dollar.
Absolutely. And the interesting or exciting thing is, what is the role that technology can play in helping these social enterprises stay afloat? Because many of them have operated on a very fragile grant-based system, year-by-year funding. They haven't had the opportunity to invest in, I guess, what we would call back-end systems to automate their processes. So, for example, the NDIS has had a really significant impact on those providers in the disability provision sector, particularly starting with young children. Yeah. Because if you're an organisation that's gotten out had a paper-based system, and maybe because you've had a grant funding method, you've only issued maybe 10 invoices a month, and all of a sudden you have to engage digitally with a portal and you're issuing hundreds of invoices a month or a week, you have to change and upgrade your systems. And so in a way, we've got some external environmental factors like the NDIS that's effectively forcing nonprofits and social enterprises to really reconsider their business model and how do they operate, and I guess force an investment in technology to just help them stay alive.
Yeah, it's a pretty fascinating space, and I'm doing some work with a small social enterprise startup, and challenges around working with NDIS is enormous for them, right? And you can just see that it's not necessarily NDIS's fault, it's all those other things that sit behind it. It can certainly be a challenge. One of the things I really wanted to talk about today was future of jobs. You've written some papers on that and some articles on that, and I wanted to perhaps unpack a little bit the World Economic Forum's report that they did recently. And when we look at that, there's some pretty key themes which we often really know about. You know, the top roles that are growing or predicted to grow over the next few years, you know, those that are declining. And so when we look at those, you know, the top 5 emerging roles are things like data analysts and scientists, AI machine learning specialists, software and application developers and analysts, etc., sales and marketing professionals, which was interesting. And then declining roles are those, you know, replicable jobs, the data entry clerks, the accounting, bookkeeping and payroll clerks, admin, executive secretaries, etc. We obviously see that in South Australia. We've seen a lot of job changes over the years, particularly with manufacturing disappearing and other things. What's required from a government perspective, right, to support the future of jobs?
It's a really big question, and it's a really big challenge. And I don't know that anyone's got the answers, but regardless, we have to have a crack. I'd like to, there's a great quote by a futurist called Alvin Toffler. And he wrote a book in 1970, would you believe, called Future Shock. And he defined future shock as too much change in too short a time period. Yeah. Now, if he said that in 1970 and we're almost 2020, I mean, the pace of change is just accelerating. And so I think what's different about this particular industrial revolution, so the World Economic Forum has kind of called it the fourth industrial revolution, is one of the important points in that report is that it explains that over the last 3 revolutions, as a society, we actually had a bit of luxury of time. You know, before, steam was everywhere and before computers were everywhere, we had maybe 20 or 30 years to kind of get our heads around the concept and to then adjust accordingly. We just don't have that luxury of time anymore. And so when you share those growing professions, absolutely, we have a dearth of around 1.5 million cybersecurity professionals around the world. And that gap's going to get bigger. But what's getting interesting is how do we think about if we've got people who are performing valuable jobs right now, but that job doesn't really have a future, how do we help people have the courage, but also the confidence and develop the competence in new areas that we really, really need? So if we take, for example, cybersecurity, we absolutely need people who've gone to university and done a degree to really understand it and do the research in that space. But for you and me in a company, I actually could have someone who does a Cert 4 at TAFE in cybersecurity, and I give them new skills every 6 months and I keep them up to speed. To me, that is just as valuable. So I think we also need to reframe the tertiary sector and the value of different kinds of qualifications. I obviously have a PhD, so I've gone to university, but there is equal value coming out of the vocational education sector that I think as a society and a community, we have to place greater value on that and not just say to our kids, yep, you have to go to university, that's the path to get a job. Actually, for some people, a better path is vocational training. In fact, it's going to get me into a more interesting, better paid job quicker than if I go to university. So the role of government in that is absolutely to really support our vocational training sector, but also to ensure that those courses that are being developed are relevant to the employer. I'm on an advisory board with Flinders University in their science space, really looking at, well, what capabilities do we want graduates to have so that they are job ready? Now, this doesn't mean that they have all the domain expertise and knowledge that they need, but do they have a mindset around problem solving? Are they willing to be creative and challenge the status quo? Do they have emotional intelligence? Are they able to work collaboratively with others? Because these are actually the skills that we need. And do they have learnability as a core capability, which means not saying, thank God I've graduated, I'm done, never have to learn again. Actually, all of us have to keep learning all the time. So government's got a really big role in helping to reframe we've got amazing value coming out of our university sector and we need to protect and grow that. But we also need to uplift the value and the perception of our vocational training sector, because sometimes, we can get a shorter on-the-job, just-in-time training could be delivered out of that sector at the quality that we need.
Because, the challenge in a lot of this tech space is how quickly it's changing. And so what you learned at university 4 years ago, in terms of the pure technical side of that course, is likely to have changed dramatically in 4 years. But it's the other elements that you talked about before in terms of how they work. Those are the skills that will carry them forward forever.
Absolutely. But let's also not discount there is huge value in people gaining that deep technical experience, because once they've really understood a technical domain, they'll pick up and learn and adapt. So let's not give up on learning domain knowledge, because otherwise we're going to have a new generation of kids who say, well, I can do everything on an app and I don't actually need to know how coding works because I can just drag and drop, using Scratch or something. No, we still need people to really delve deep into understanding this. But I think it's also understanding that just because you're a technical genius doesn't mean you're going to be successful if you can't work well with people. It's that human element. And I'm actually so excited about this industrial revolution, because I think it gives us an opportunity to harness what makes us unique as humans. We don't have to do the dull, repetitive work that a machine can do with way better accuracy than we can. We still need humans overseeing it and checking it and setting the ethics into that and the guidelines. And we can't abdicate our responsibility as humans to machines. That's very scary. And we can have a conversation about the ethics too, because that's fascinating.
I was going to pick up on that point, because that's a big piece, right? And that's the piece that I think most people are challenged with. Whose ethics?
Whose ethics, exactly. If I was very fortunate, I heard Dr Simon Longstaff, so he's the Chief Executive of the Ethics Centre in Australia, and he gave a fascinating talk at a blockchain conference I was at earlier this week, and he made some really interesting comments around the fact that as we are identifying these new emerging technologies that are incredibly exciting and they do allow us to solve problems in new ways, that we at the same time, we're really conscious of building the ethical infrastructure that matches the technical infrastructure. And he kind of said, well, look at what's happening around us. Look at, some royal commissions that have happened recently. They shake our confidence in the ethics of how things run, or our sporting heroes. And he talked about this really interesting concept called moral injury, which I'd never heard of. But he said, imagine that you were on the witness stand in that royal commission into the finance and banking industry, and you were the person that had to admit that your institution had been charging dead people fees for services. He said those people are now at great risk of really having mental health issues, because they're saying, well, that's not my ethics. How did I suddenly end up in a place where that was somehow deemed as okay? I think we need to have a great deal of empathy for these people who've found themselves in a situation that is probably personally quite horrifying to them. And just because we can do something certainly does not mean we should.
And that's the challenge for technology, isn't it? Because the ethics aren't built in necessarily into the way in which technology works and the way in which we serve, whereas people, those ethics are still there. Even if they're different from one person to the next, there are still a bunch of cultural norms and acceptances that when you're dealing one-on-one with people are often there.
And then I think, what I appreciate about being at Microsoft is the current CEO, Satya Nadella. He's really been very explicit around developing artificial intelligence and maintaining an ethical basis in that. And I think to have leaders who are very explicit around this is fascinating. And if we look at some of the other big ones, on the other hand, I read a great article that said, well, actually, who gave Mark Zuckerberg the authority to determine what free speech looks like on the planet? No one gave him that right, but it's emerged. And I think that's why I say this permeation of technology through every aspect of our lives, we need to think about the ethics of it, but who is governing it? Who is making these decisions around what is the right thing to do? And I'm so impressed by, Jacinta Ardern, who's come out in the last week around the horrific events in Christchurch and said, the one thing we do not give to this person is notoriety.
Absolutely.
He shall remain nameless. Instead, let's honour the victims. And so I think we need to start challenging, how do we want to live as a society?
So thinking about the ethics piece, and particularly perhaps in organisational settings, it's very easy, I think, for organisations to not look too far forward in terms of their ability to change and grow their workforce with the change that's happening inside of their industry. And you talk a little bit about agile lifelong learning and that being part of that. What do organisations need to do today, do you think, to make sure that they are ready for change and it's not just a matter of, well, the world's changed and sorry, thanks for being with us for 10 years, but your job's now gone? Where do you think their responsibility lies and what do you think they can do about that?
I think organisations can do a huge amount. That World Economic Forum Jobs of the Future, or Future of Jobs report rather, that really, it did an interesting thing. It looked at organisations who viewed human resources and people and culture at the level of the senior executive leadership team of the organisation. So say, for example, that person, so the Chief Human Resource Officer or the Chief Director People and Culture, is at the same table as the Chief Executive and their direct reports. Organisations who had placed a real understanding and emphasis on their people were those who crafted training, they understood the capabilities of their people, and also they did some future workforce planning. Yep. I think organisations have not been strong at future workforce planning. There has been this attitude of, well, if I don't have the people now, I'll find them. But quite frankly, everyone's trying to find them and those people don't exist. We've got to create them. And again, back to the ethical dilemma, the Future of Jobs report outlined that those roles that are at greatest risk of automation are those where women are the majority in that group, so administration and lower level management. Many women are in those jobs because those jobs afford flexibility. I can come in and out of the workforce with family or caring responsibilities. My super is then lower. I might have been out of the workforce at a critical point when suddenly maybe somehow email was introduced or a new tool was introduced in the organisation and I'm unfamiliar with that. So I think organisations have a double duty to really focus on those people at the more vulnerable end and identify, if we can't just move them on because that's not the right thing to do, how do we help to develop their skills so that they can provide new value in ways that actually adds value to them, it keeps them employable. And, when you couple that with this horrible statistic that actually the fastest growing group of homeless people in our country are women over 55.
Yeah, I heard that. I've read that somewhere. Well, I can't remember where I read that, but...
The Council of the Ageing, and there's also a Federal Commissioner into Ageing. They've done a lot of research into this, and it's really tragic because... and actually, Jane Caro gave a great speech about this at the International Women's Day breakfast in Adelaide a couple of weeks ago, where she said those women, because she said it was fascinating, she was part of that first wave of women who actually didn't have to feel ashamed of having a job. She said before the 60s, if a woman worked, it's actually because she had to and she was pitied. And I feel so incredibly grateful that I'm part of a generation of women where, no, it's expected, go out and work and have ambition and do great things and give back. But she said those women who kind of followed the rules and then they went and had children and then they were out of the workforce and then they went back into the workforce and then their parents got sick, they went out again. Because they've come in and out and maybe a marriage broke down, they've got almost no super, they can't access the pension until they're 67 and they are living in cars. And these women, this cohort have such value because it's like we discount the fact that, running a household and bringing up a family doesn't require skills. Oh my gosh, you need to be completely, think of the organisational skills these people have and the ability to multitask. So I think back to our perception of TAFE, our perception of ageism, it is a thing, it exists. And how do we as employers make sure we retain these people? We don't add to any, further distress they may have in their lives, but we help give them new opportunities to stay engaged and be able to contribute.
Do you think organisations get it? I mean, we talk about, the war on talent, right? So you mentioned before, organisations being a little bit blind and going, well, if I don't have the talent, I'll just go and get it. And at some point when that talent is scarce, it becomes a bit of a war, which obviously means you pay a lot more. Clearly, I think there's a case for saying if I invest in my people now, it's going to return for me at an organisation at a profit level, probably much better than it is if I don't do that, because I'm not going to pay redundancies. I'm not going to have that changeover in workforce, which then costs a lot of time and money. Given that a lot of organisations don't get that, how do we get that message out there? Is that a government's responsibility to get that message out there? Is it organisations just waking up one day and getting that to understanding that message?
I think there's actually a bit of a coalition of the willing who understand this is a challenge. Yeah. So I think the AICD, Australian Institute of Company Directors, I think they certainly understand it. At a director level, what questions are directors asking their chief executives and their senior leadership teams around their ability for that organisation to continue into the future. And workforce capability is a massive part of that. So the AICD certainly understands it. I think universities are actually picking up on professional education. So how do we bring professionals in to train them? I think there's still a bit of an attitude, and I remember one of my bosses telling me, he said, but what if I train my people and they leave? And then the HR manager says, but what if you don't train your people and they don't leave? I mean, that's even worse.
It's even scarier. Yeah, that's
it's
right.
Scarier. So, and I think I don't know, my philosophy is, well, we've got to develop our people because we have to help them develop to their best potential, because that'll be actually of benefit to me and to the community. And guess what? If they find another job that is fabulous and gives them opportunity to grow, good for them. We've still benefited from that. And that's how you become an employer of choice, which is by providing these opportunities. And, at Microsoft, and I think government has the same perception, 70% of learning is on the job. It's what you do every day. It's how you learn new skills, 20% through mentoring and coaching, and 10% is through formal education. So again, it's not just the owners of companies, it's also managers. If you're a frontline manager and you are maybe not confident in your skin and you maybe feel that someone on your team might be more capable of you and you feel threatened, your motivation to help your people, to train your people is probably not high. So we really need to speak to managers and get to first, new managers, frontline managers about the real value in training people. And let's hire the smartest people. Hire someone smarter than me. Awesome. I've hired amazingly smart people in my career, and I'm hoping one day I will get to report to them because they're 20 years younger than me. So they'll be growing. So I think there's a confidence issue too, and let's not feel threatened that maybe other people have different capabilities than us.
And I think particularly in the context of lifelong learning, we don't just learn in a vacuum, right? We learn when we hire really smart people, and they may have skills and capabilities that you don't. Well, guess what? You will be a better leader, a better person as you learn from those people that you hire. I think the rate of change is going to drive people to do more in this space. I think one of the challenges leaders have, and whether that's a CEO or whether that's in government, is that the tenure is not often a long time, 3 years, 4 years. And so to think and focus on a workforce transformation that might happen in 5 or 6 years or 10 years is less likely than if it's going to happen in 1 or 2 years. And so I think the rate of change is probably going to accelerate people waking up and thinking that they have to do something about it.
It's a bit of a burning platform.
Yeah,
agreed. How do we get people to get a sense of urgency? I have, I think, a natural bias for action. I'm a bit impatient, but I also know when I have to be patient. And speaking with my colleagues around culture and how do we build a culture that really supports and recognises high performance and ethics and the right behaviour, it takes a long time. It takes a lot of persistence. Conversely, a poor leader can destroy a culture very quickly, and we've seen that in the world. But I did come across some really interesting research the Gallup Institute did, and it would have been in the early 2000s. They spoke to 10,000 people to understand what are the needs of followers. So when you're following a leader, what do I as a follower need? And they found 4 things: hope, trust, empathy, and stability. So when a leader can provide those 4 things, I am prepared to absolutely follow that person. And so when I think about my people and my managers in my team, how do I help to make them aware? And we've actually crafted a fabulous people manager training program in DPC with some of my peers to really, and there is a big focus in the public sector now around how do we develop our frontline managers, because the more skills and knowledge we can equip our people managers with, the better they'll be, because people join great companies and leave awful managers. And I've escaped a micromanager and it was a horrible experience. So I don't want to have that kind of scenario in my organisation. So how do we give people hope or purpose? How do we provide stability? And it is a lot of change. So there's lots going on. How do I provide a thread that runs through? I'm empathetic, I'm approachable, I'm authentic, I understand my people's needs, and they feel they can trust me because I demonstrate that my behaviour, I'm consistent and I follow through. And if we can help our managers do those things, I think that will help our culture.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, if that was in early 2000, here we are, 15, 18 years later, in a time where more change promotes more instability and, certainly erodes hope for a lot of people in terms of either their own careers or the things that are happening around them in their organisation. Those things will be even more important. People will be even more hyper-aware that that's what they need.
Absolutely. And there is a difference between a manager and a leader. They have very different functions, which are both equally important, but anyone is a leader. If you have people who will follow and listen to you that you can persuade and share ideas with, and they're kind of on your side and they get on your bus, you don't have to be a manager of anyone. So I think everyone has the capacity to think about, how do I bring people on that journey? And, I think, we talked about your passion project being this awesome experience and conversation. My passion project is helping young girls really understand that, or having visible role models of women in the tech sector, that they can actually say, well, actually, maybe I can expand my horizons and I don't have to be a hairdresser or a beauty therapist, because more options are visible to me.
And is that what HerTechPath is all about?
Yeah, it is. So I started that about 2 years ago, and it kind of was just an idea of, well, surely there are lots of women working in the tech sector, and surely there's something we can do to promote how great it is and the impact that you can have. And so Kelly, whom you interviewed a couple of weeks ago, she's part of HerTechPath. And so we agreed that there are kind of two core things that we're doing, because you can't fix the world right in 10 minutes. So let's start small and be a bit modest and do something achievable. So one is actually creating an opportunity for women in the tech sector to network. There's kind of lots of, I guess, anecdotal and other research that shows women don't actually network. They don't see the value in networking. And it's less about who you know, it's more about who knows you actually, in terms of getting your next job or getting an assignment. And so we provide a kind of an informal networking opportunity for women. Many of them have their own startup or work in a startup or in a big organisation. So that's one aspect of it. But the second one is actually we go out to high schools and we go and speak to girls and we give a briefing. And our first one was amazing. It was at Lefevre High School, and we ran it in their pastoral care session. So about 250 girls from year 8 to year 11. And this was our first one, so we quite didn't know what we were doing and they didn't know what to expect from us. But you know what? When we asked the question of, well, what would you do if Facebook shut down? Oh my gosh, well, that created a stir from girls who that's part of their social interaction. We talked about then the value of technology. They were curious about, how did we get to the jobs that we were in? How did we deal with the different challenges? Had we faced discrimination? How did we balance a family? And then at the end, a couple of girls came up and said, look, thank you so much for showing that there are more opportunities than just hairdressing and beauty.
Yeah, brilliant.
And I was just staggered because, I guess, I've grown up a very fortunate childhood and background, and my parents are still married to each other. So that's not that, not that common these days. But there are girls who don't see that there is a future for them in a non-traditional space. So we did about 18 briefings in our first big stint, and we spoke to around 1,600 girls. And so we're about to launch actually officially in June, which is very exciting, and have an online, because you've got to use technology these days, Ben, and I was the bottleneck. It was very manual to make it all happen. But now an automated booking system where a school can go online and book for a session with us on hertechpath.org. And then we've got about 100 volunteers. And so a group will come to your school and be a visible role model to girls and answer questions in a really safe environment about, what could you be doing in your future?
Yeah, brilliant. That's fantastic. It sort of leads into what I wanted to talk about in terms of personal responsibility for lifelong learning, because we've talked a little bit about what governments should do. We've talked a reasonable amount about what corporations should do. But where does the responsibility lie for individuals? Because they can't just sit there and wait for people to do stuff, give them training, give them a career path. If you're talking to people who are in jobs that are potentially at risk, according to the World Economic Forum's report, what's your recommendation to them?
So I think my first recommendation is that we have a lot to answer for as a society, because unfortunately this message of the fourth industrial revolution and automation has been packaged up with a lot of fear.
Yeah.
The robots are taking over, and a report that was actually being now seen as maybe not as accurate. It originally claimed that up to 40% of jobs will change or, die over the next 10 years. And it was turned out actually it's only about 16%. But I'm not sure that second message got through, and people get really scared. And when people get scared, they're actually not open to learning. So I think we actually need to say, look, as an individual, yes, we're all responsible for our own career. We're unfortunately not entitled to anything. We have a lot of obligations as a citizen, and we have our own responsibilities to family or children or partners or to the community. And so I think it's about also not feeling panicked. All of us can do something. Even if you're just curious about, well, what does artificial intelligence actually mean? Or when we talk about ethics, what does it mean? just find some articles, just start to read. You can take small steps. It doesn't mean you need to go and do a new bachelor's degree in something. Maybe there is a short course online. There are so many of these MOOCs, the massive online open college courses that you could do. There's free stuff from like Harvard and Stanford and of really interesting topics. So I think you've got to, think about what you're interested in, what fascinates you, and just start learning a little bit, and don't make it so overwhelming that you can't manage the rest of your life, because it just gets exhausting and we stop. But if you can kind of make it fun and weave it into something you're interested about. And I think the great thing is, because as we move into automation, as I said, that human element becomes stronger. So anyone who's got great experience in emotional intelligence or dealing with challenging conversations or, understanding how people tick, great customer service, these are things that robots can't really do, right? Empathy is something that we haven't trained a machine to do. Teaching others, being a great role model, these are things that humans do exceptionally well. So I think we can all think about what are our strengths being a human. Let's capitalize on them, but also get curious about what it means. What does automation mean, and what might happen to my job? And look out to see, are there mergers happening? Is there some financial concerns in some industries? Be a bit curious about your own sector, but also think about, how might my skills be transferable to a new sector? And I bet your bottom dollar, a lot of it is. So I think be open-minded, and please don't be scared. Be hopeful about what's possible.
I presented I ran a training session for about over 50s people last Saturday, and as part of the Fed Government's Be Connected program. And one of the things we talked about was change has always been there. And so, I put up some really interesting pictures around, people sitting on the train, with their phones, with their heads plugged into their phones. And we think that people are, antisocial. And then I found a photo of some, back in 1950, of people sitting on the train all with their face in a newspaper. Change happens, right? It just does. And it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be scary. And the more I think we know and understand, the more comfortable we're going to be with the change that's coming. So, brilliant.
Very exciting.
Thank you so much for joining us. I know you're super busy, so we might wrap it up there. But thank you very much. We appreciate your time.
Thank you, Ben. It's been a great conversation.
Cheers. Thanks, Eva.
It sure is a pretty interesting time in the world, regardless of whether you're an employer or an employee. I think the key takeaway from my discussion with Eva, and a topic that I'm really passionate about, is don't wait for change to happen before you do something about changing who you are or what your business does. Start now. You might be able to use it as a competitive differentiator, and don't leave it until it's too late. If you want to find out more about Eva or HerTechPath, head over to our website, www.theselfmadetheory.com.